I think more and more mainstream investors are saying this is a massive systemic risk right at the heart of the world's capital system. We have to address this now. And the fact that the governor of the Bank of England has himself said he doesn't really believe that financial institutions have got their act together when it comes to appraising that risk, I think that tells us something about where this is now beginning to attract mainstream attention. I think that a lot of the big institutions are getting much smarter about this than we might imagine. There's news out recently, for instance, that the Norwegian pension fund has decided now to delist, to get out of all pure play coal companies. So any company that has, I think it's more than 30% of its revenues coming from coal will now be delisted by what is the largest pension fund in the world and one of the most influential too. And if you look around, you can begin to see how those decisions are impacting on the world of hydrocarbons. And it'll start essentially by getting rid of pure play coal, then mixed coal and gas companies. And you can sort of see a slow route to a progressive delisting of the hydrocarbon-based companies over time. This is all about momentum. One of the things about capital markets that we've learned to our cost in the past is that they are subject to herd mentality. Very few people break ranks when a kind of particular approach and orthodoxy is dominant or prevalent, even if people caught in that orthodoxy know that it's really unsustainable, that it's a bubble. But because they're caught in it, they don't dare break ranks. I have a sort of hunch that we're going to see herd thinking, herd reactions kick in with this whole story about unburnable carbon. And when it does, those investors will move incredibly fast to de-risk their holdings, first in coal companies and then progressively in hydrocarbon-based companies. Now, that isn't something that you'll hear many analysts talking about in public, but when you ask them what they think might trip the wire, as it were, kick the system into a different equilibrium, they basically say, when everybody does it. Because when everybody does it, guess what? We'll all think we're really smart. Actually, we're all really late, but nonetheless, we'll have some comfort from the fact that we're moving as a herd. One of the places where we have to make a much more convincing case is around infrastructure, because it's perfectly clear that many of the low-carbon technologies we can call on now will actually make society more resilient, better prepared to cope with some of the extremes that are coming down the track at us. If we can do things in a more decentralized and distributed way, for instance, that helps build resilience. If we can rely on technology that is not all about huge, large-scale generating systems or water purification systems, whatever it might be, then again, we can build resilience into this. If our infrastructure is less locked into carbon-intensive energy and materials consumption, then our economy is more resilient. So all of these things actually build resilience in our society. And I think that's the bit that we've got to get our heads around. Most of the infrastructure investment being made at the moment is locking us into high carbon demand, high carbon consumption, high carbon production for the next 20, 30 years. And it'll be too late to change things around at that stage. So we've got to get this argument about resilience as part and parcel of a low-carbon society through to the people who are essentially making investments of trillions of dollars into our economies all around the world, rich world and poor world. Trillions of dollars going into energy, waste, water, transport infrastructure, IT infrastructure. These are just massive flows of money through the economy, much of which is still going in the wrong direction when it could be going in the direction that would build low-carbon economies as well as greater resilience. I think the history about coming up with the right economic instruments to manage what economists call the externality of greenhouse gas emissions is a long and sorry story. It really is. Because economists have been saying for a very long time, going right back to, well, certainly to Nick Stern's report more than nearly 10 years ago, and in fact to many reports before that, they've always said if you want to address an externality, then you have to embody that externality, you have to internalize it onto companies' balance sheets, onto governments' accounting for different things, into the way in which the market values things. You have to bring the externality in and price it properly. So economists may differ about how you do the pricing, whether it's through a tax or some other instrument, but they certainly all agree that markets only work when you internalize cost efficiently. So the cost we pay, the price we pay for something reflects its true cost. And it's been a very, very slow, grudging process, which has now held us back from carbon commanding a proper price, a global price in the global economy. Again, however, I'm really encouraged by the fact that now countries which command more than a third of total global GDP, and possibly as much as a half, are all signed up to the idea of there being a proper price on carbon, a global price on carbon. There's a gathering sense in the run-up to Paris that there has to be an in-principle agreement about carbon pricing. And in truth, we can't really deal with climate change on any basis until we pay for the greenhouse gases, primarily the CO2 that we emit. Once we do that, many, many things will start changing in the markets. And there are simple ways, honestly, simple ways of addressing what could be regressive impacts on poorer communities, poorer societies, poorer countries. There are all sorts of ways of coming up with different economic instruments to ensure that the poorest don't suffer again as a consequence of policy making. But we have to have that simple, central tenet of effective markets at the heart of what we're doing. We have to be able to internalize that cost. I guess you can look at the world's capital markets and cut this both ways, to be honest, as a total percentage of the flows of capital going into economic activity of one kind or another. More sustainable, greener investments are still a very small fraction of that total resource flow. But that very small fraction gets bigger and bigger every year, and it gets bigger by a bigger margin. And this arrival of green bonds, for instance, in the last 4 to 5 years is clearly very material to how these investment flows are changing. Corporate bonds are becoming much more easily available, or companies are much more prepared to start taking advantage of bringing money in on that basis. There's a readiness now to look much more experimentally at some of the different ways of organizing financial flows. So if you take it from the perspective of, is it gradually building and getting better? Yes, it is. Is it gradually changing fast enough? No, because basically we need to be seeing billions and billions of these investments moving in that direction, moving out of these various small scale, sometimes even niche asset classes, and becoming the mainstream. And we're still some way away from that. I'm sort of more hopeful about things now than I've been for quite a long time. Obviously not because of what's happening out there in the big wide world. It's very difficult to be hopeful, let alone optimistic, when you look at the evidence base, you look at the data sets in terms of climate, biodiversity, build-up of different wastes in society and so on. There's no false reason or false hope in any of that data. But the things that are now being marshaled, the strengths, the forces that are being marshaled to address that, look completely different to me now than was the case 5 years ago, let alone 15, 20, or 40 years ago when I first started out on this particular journey. And it's coming from so many different places now. The readiness on the part of progressive companies to take leadership roles, the readiness on the part of innovators, technologists, creators, designers, to step up there and bring into the marketplace brilliant new products and services that help us to reduce the impact of the things that we want, the goods and services we want on the natural environment and on people. You can see a kind of marshalling in the world's religions and faith systems. I'm personally persuaded that things won't happen at a fast enough pace until the world's religions wake up to just what is going on out there. And I'm greatly encouraged by some of the changes in that area. If you hear the way young people talk about this, it's different. They're not arguing about whether or not there has to be change. They know there has to be change, but they refuse to go along with the kind of change processes that might once have been thought as necessary. So if you look at all these different factors, you look at technology, you look at faith and religion, you look at progressive businesses, you look at young people, this is a powerful set of institutional, personal and collective forces that are being marshaled. Is that enough to change the political systems that seem to be almost impervious to these pressures? Personally, I think it is. And I am more hopeful now that those systems will begin to adopt a completely different orientation towards our relationship with the natural world than has ever happened before. And I'm still persuaded that that can be done in time. I do not subscribe to this notion that it's already too late. If it can happen in the next 5 to 10 years, then that's still going to deliver massive improvements in an inherently dysfunctional system that we have today.